By 1958, the world had never heard anything like it. Not the sound of a jet at altitude, smooth and distant, but the sound of one at full thrust on the runway, spooling up from a standing start, pushing 130 tons of aircraft and fuel toward a speed no airliner had ever chased before. Those who witnessed a 707 takeoff for the first time all seemed to say the same thing. It felt like being launched. That word kept appearing in the accounts. Not flown, not carried, launched, and the pilots who sat at the front of it, who had their hands on the controls as those 4 Pratt and Whitney turbojets lit up and the airframe shuddered against its own power, they reached for the same language. Rockets, catapults, something that was not quite an aircraft in any sense they had previously understood the word. This is the story of why the Boeing 707 felt the way it did, what it asked of the people who flew it, and why a generation of pilots who grew up in the propeller age found themselves sitting inside something that had rewritten every instinct they had ever developed in the air. These were powerful machines by the standards of their era, but they were also physical, mechanical, and deeply communicative in the way that spinning metal always is. You felt them through the airframe. You heard them change note with every power adjustment. You managed them constantly. Cylinder head temperatures, manifold pressure, fuel mixture, propeller pitch. Flying a long-range piston airliner was an act of sustained mechanical negotiation. The 707 ended that negotiation. Not gradually, immediately. Boeing had been working toward this moment since the late 1940s. The company had watched the jet engine change military aviation and drawn the obvious conclusion. The same transformation was coming to the airlines. The question was not whether to build a jet transport, but how to build one that could actually operate in the commercial world, on real routes, in real weather, with real economics attached to every flight hour. The aircraft that became the 707 started life as the Model 36780, the Dash 80, a company-funded prototype that Boeing built at its own risk without a single airline order to justify the investment. The Dash 80 flew on July 15, 1954. It was a calculated gamble that cost Boeing $16 million at a time when the company had no guarantee the airlines would buy what they were building. Pan American World Airways made that gamble pay off. On October 13, 1955, Pan Am ordered 20 Boeing 707s and 25 Douglas DC-8s simultaneously, the first airline in history to place competing jet orders on the same day. The message to the industry was clear. The jet age had arrived, and the airlines that moved first would define it. Those that waited would be explaining to their passengers why the aircraft next to them at the gate was smoother, faster, and quieter than anything they were being offered. The 707-120, the initial production variant, was powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney JT-3C turbojet engines, each producing 13,500 pounds of thrust with water injection. Later, the JT-3D turbofan replaced the turbojet across most of the fleet, improving fuel efficiency and reducing noise while pushing thrust figures higher. The aircraft cruised between 530 and 600 miles per hour depending on variant and conditions, at altitudes between 35,000 and 42,000 feet. Range on the Intercontinental 707-32 stretched to over 6,000 miles. These were not refinements of what existed. They were a different order of capability entirely. But the numbers, impressive as they were, do not explain what pilots felt when they flew it. The numbers describe performance. The pilots describe something closer to personality. The first thing that struck every pilot transitioning to the 707 from piston equipment was the power delivery. A piston engine builds its thrust through mechanical complexity, through pistons and valves and propeller pitch, and that complexity has a texture to it. You feel the engine working. A turbojet delivers thrust differently. It is smooth, continuous, and it builds in a way that initially seems almost detached from the aircraft itself. A rising tone that is more sensation than sound. Then the thrust arrives. And when it does not push the aircraft. It drives it. Pilots who came from propeller aircraft described the acceleration on takeoff as something that pressed them back into their seats in a way nothing had done before. Not violently, not uncomfortably, but unmistakably. There is a phrase that circulated among the first generation of 707 pilots. You were not flying the aircraft, you were directing it. The 707 had enough energy at its disposal that the pilot's primary job on departure was management rather than coaxing. You were not persuading the aircraft into the air. You were controlling when and how it chose to get there. That distinction sounds subtle. In practice, it was the difference between everything they had known before and everything that came after. The handling qualities of the 707 were not universally gentle. The aircraft was large, fast, and responsive in ways that demanded respect. Its controls were hydraulically boosted, a system that gave pilots the authority to move the control surfaces of a 150-ton aircraft without physically overpowering them, but also one that removed some of the direct tactile feedback that propeller pilots had relied on to understand what the aircraft was doing. You were not feeling the airflow through the surfaces. You were feeling the hydraulic system's representation of it. It was accurate, it was precise, but it was different, and the difference required adjustment. The 707's swept wing, inclined at 35 degrees, introduced handling characteristics that piston pilots had never managed at scale. Sweep produces a tendency toward Dutch roll, a coupled oscillation in yaw and roll that the 707's yaw damper was designed to suppress. With the yaw damper operating normally, the aircraft was stable and predictable. Without it, the Dutch roll could develop into something that required active management. Pilots learned early that the 707 systems were not redundancies, they were dependencies. The aircraft flew the way it flew because the systems worked the way they worked. Understanding that relationship was the first lesson of 707 flying. The approach and landing added another dimension. The 707 carried its speed. That phrase meant something specific in early jet aviation. Turbojets had poor throttle response compared to what pilots would eventually come to expect from high-bypass turbofans. If you reduced power too early on final approach, you could not recover it quickly enough to correct a sink rate that was developing faster than the engines could respond. The technique that emerged from early 707 operations was to carry slightly more power, slightly more speed, farther into the approach than felt instinctively correct to pilots trained on propeller aircraft. You kept the engines in a part of their operating range where they could respond when you needed them. The sonic character of the 707's approach was itself unlike anything regional or domestic airports had encountered before. Communities near major airports in 1958 and 1959 had adjusted to the sound of propeller transports, which was significant but manageable. The 707's JT-3C turbojets on approach produced a sound that penetrated differently, a sustained penetrating tone that civic authorities in multiple cities took formal action to address within the aircraft's first years of service. Pilots were aware that the aircraft announced itself. There was no such thing as a quiet 707 arrival. Inside the cockpit, the 707 required 3 people to fly it operationally: captain, first officer, and flight engineer, whose station occupied the right rear of the flight deck and whose instrument panel covered the aircraft's fuel, hydraulic, electrical, and pressurization systems with a density that reflected the complexity underneath. The flight engineer was not administrative support. They were a technical specialist in continuous operation, and the 707 systems were complex enough that removing them from the crew would not have been a reduction in headcount, but a reduction in capability. Pilots who flew the aircraft described the 3-person cockpit as the natural state of things for an aircraft of that size and generation. The workload was distributed because the workload was real. The 707 also introduced pilots to a different relationship with altitude. Piston airliners cruised between 20,000 and 25,000 feet, where weather was still a constant presence, and turbulence was a routine part of the passenger experience. The 707's service ceiling pushed into the low 40,000s, above the weather systems that had defined propeller travel, above the turbulence layers that passengers had accepted as part of flight. The cabin pressure differential required to maintain a breathable environment at those altitudes was itself a structural engineering achievement. Pilots who had spent careers threading DC-6 through weather fronts found themselves flying over the top of them instead. The geography of the flight changed with the altitude. There were limits, and the pilots who flew the 707 understood them clearly. The aircraft was not forgiving of imprecision at low speed. Its energy management demanded attention from the moment the approach briefing began. The combination of swept wing, high wing loading, and turbojet throttle response created a narrow band within which the final approach had to be flown. Too fast, and the aircraft floated past the touchdown zone. Too slow, and the sink rate developed before the engines could arrest it. The band was manageable. It was not wide. The 707 also asked its crews to think in time rather than distance. At cruise speed, the distances involved in navigation, in weather avoidance, in descent planning, were large enough that every calculation had to begin earlier than propeller experience suggested. A pilot who began their descent at the same point, a DC-6 crew, would have found themselves crossing the outer marker at an altitude and speed that made a stabilized approach difficult to achieve. The 707 was always arriving earlier than it looked like it was arriving. That lesson had to be learned, and the simulator time and transition training of the late 1950s and early 1960s was shaped substantially by teaching pilots to think at jet scale. What pilots ultimately remembered about the 707 was not any single characteristic, but the sum of them. It was the first aircraft in the commercial world that felt like it had surplus speed. Everything that propeller aviation had required its aircraft to conserve carefully was available in the 707 in quantities that redefined what flying felt like from the front seat. Pan American introduced the 707 to transatlantic revenue service on October 26, 1958, flying from New York to Paris. The crossing that had taken the Constellation nearly 14 hours took the 707 just over 7. Passengers who had boarded exhausted in one era landed in another one. For the pilots, the experience was even more direct. They had not just flown a faster aircraft, they had operated a machine that asked them to become different professionals, to think faster, to plan farther ahead, to manage systems rather than wrestle engines, to understand that the aircraft they were flying was more capable than any instinct their previous careers had given them. That is what the pilots meant when they reached for the word rocket. They did not mean it was dangerous. They did not mean it was uncontrollable. They meant that nothing in their training, nothing in their experience, nothing in their understanding of what an airliner was supposed to be had prepared them for the scale of what the 707 offered. The runway disappeared behind it faster than anything should. And when they landed, when the thrust reversers came on and the aircraft decelerated from that world back into the ordinary one, more than a few of them sat for a moment before going through the shutdown checklist, not from relief, from something closer to recognition. They had just flown the future, and the future was considerably faster than the past. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you are first to know when the next one lands.